the House bill, as you know, was sort of awful to a lot of people in the individual market, right? It kind of stripped a lot of the consumer protections, or potentially stripped a lot of the consumer protections for people with pre-existing conditions. And it wasn't so great to Medicaid either. It rolled back Obamacare's Medicaid expansion. But what made that bill so controversial was really what it did to the individual market. It was crueler to the individual market. Let's put it that way.
What I recall is that bill essentially completely deregulated the individual market, such that
it gave states the opportunity to completely deregulate it, and slashed subsidies for people to buy insurance, and restructured them in ways that didn't make sense, and would have deeply penalized the old and sick especially. So that was sort of in a lot of ways, the most remarkable thing about that bill. The Senate bill, and I don't want to underplay how awfully the House bill treated Medicaid, but what the Senate has gone and done is created a bill that is a little bit gentler to the individual market, right? But just decimates Medicaid over the long term, just absolutely decimates Medicaid. And what you have to understand is that Medicaid is America's biggest health insurance program. It is, at least by enrollment, it is 62 million people. It is the size of Medicare and the individual market combined, right? I mean, Medicaid is this immense part of the American healthcare system, and the Senate bill just throttles it. It's really remarkable. And so how do they do that? Well, both the House and Senate want to do something historic by capping Medicaid's per patient spending, right? This has never been done before. Yeah.
To back up a little bit, how is Medicaid presently funded? My understanding is it's a joint kind of state-federal program.
Yeah. And so the way it works now is that states and the federal government basically split the cost of every Medicaid patient. And the federal government kicks in a different amount of money, or a different percentage of the cost depending on the state, but it's always a fixed percentage. So, I'm kind of pulling out a number of thin air, but if the federal government says we're going to pay 60% of every South Carolinian's Medicaid expenses, then it's 60% whether or not it costs $7,000 or $3,000 to cover them for the year, right? So that's the basics of how it works. And so there's sort of this unlimited budget for the program. It's an open-ended entitlement, as people like to say. Republicans want to end that. What they want to do instead is cap the amount of money that the government would kick in each year to the states. So each state only gets its $4,000 per patient or $5,000 per patient, or probably less than that. But so you set this pool of money, you put this per capita cap in place. But the problem is you have to adjust that for inflation, at least, right? Or inflation is going to eat the program away to nothing. And so the House bill, it used this measure called the CPIM, or the medical consumption, or the medical cost element of the Consumer Price Index. And that is expected to grow slower than Medicaid would otherwise. And so it still amounts to a budget cut, but it's still somewhat related to, medical costs over the long term.
Right.
The Senate kind of takes this idea and then makes it more draconian. And so basically they do the same thing as the House for several years, up until 2025. But then in 2025, they switch the inflation measure. So instead of growing the program based on medical inflation, they just use the regular old Consumer Price Index. And the Consumer Price Index, that's the thing that also tracks the cost of food, the cost of television, the cost of your carpet, of the books on your bookshelf. It's all this stuff completely unrelated to medical care, and it grows much, much more slowly than the cost of medical care. And so eventually, over time, the value of Medicaid funding is just Medicaid's funding is not going to keep up with the cost of providing for sick people, of paying for people's hospital stays and for their checkups and for their medications. And so states are going to have to make the program less and less generous. And, this all sounds extremely technical, but the difference between what the Senate is doing and what the House proposed, we're talking over the long term, hundreds of billions of dollars. We're talking immense change. It's the kind of, this would be absolutely devastating to Medicaid. And so the question you may be wondering is, why are they, they're devastating Medicaid. Why are they doing that? It's like, well, it's because it looks like they're trying to spend a little bit more to make the reforms to the individual market a little less abhorrent, I guess, or a little bit more politically palatable. Essentially, Republicans have decided that they're going to, or the Senate Republicans have decided they're going to try and keep Obamacare's tax credit structure in place the subsidies for individuals that people can use to buy individual health insurance. They're going to keep the same basic structure of that in place, but they're just going to make them a little bit less generous. they're going to make fewer people eligible for them, and the subsidies will cover essentially less care. They'll be worth less money, but they'll still be higher for the poor, and they'll still be targeted towards low income people. And they won't kind of leave people hanging out to dry quite the same way the House bill did.
Right. I mean, what you've described sounds less like an Obamacare repeal bill, which is how this has been framed and sold, and more like a Medicaid repeal bill.
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's reminiscent of welfare reform. I know it's a subject you've written a bunch about, I've written about. One of the most important things that the Republicans and, Bill Clinton did to welfare back in the 1990s was they block granted the program, and essentially the per capita cap that Republicans are now contemplating for Medicaid is a version of a block grant. It's less restrictive, but it's still it's a cousin of that idea. And that just means that you send a set amount of money to the states each year. And then what they did with welfare was they just didn't adjust it for inflation. They let inflation eat away the value of the program. That's not quite what they're doing here. They're still going to adjust it for inflation, but they're not going to allow the program's funding to keep pace with the cost of actually providing care to people. And so its value is essentially going to be eroded over time. It's going to pay for less and less care.
And I assume that because the value is eroding over time, what's probably likely to happen on the state level, states begin restricting enrollment to make up for the declining funds.
Well, it's actually even more complicated than that.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah, right. It's actually more complicated, badder than that. If you can imagine, there are a few things the states could do, right? Because on the one hand, they still get money per enrollee. However, you only get so much for each person. So one thing that incentivizes you to do is to just, cut what Medicaid will cover. You're sort of incentivized to just make the program stingier. Just say, oh, we're not going to cover prescription drugs, or, we're going to, there are all sorts of optional services like dental care that Medicaid doesn't have to cover. And those are probably going to go in a lot of states. So it's, we're going to pay doctors less. And as a result, fewer doctors will probably accept the program. That's one thing you can do. Another thing is to try and find ways just to weed out really expensive patients. And again, it's not exactly clear how states can do this, but as you and I both know, they've proven exceptionally good at keeping people away from welfare. So I imagine they will find creative ways to keep very sick people away from Medicaid. So it's to kind of make sure that you just enroll the cheapest Medicaid patients, which essentially, boils down to the healthiest ones, and you leave the sick out in the kind of cold. In the end, you're still seeing the total amount of funding go down. And so, one easy way to do that is just enroll. If the states are going to have to shoulder more of the burden for this program, they are going to be tempted to just enroll fewer people so that they are on the hook for less money.
To back up real quick, part of the political obstacles to passing this, or some Republican senators say that they are worried about what the House bill did to Medicaid. And this is sort of taking the House bill's approach to Medicaid and going even further. And it's kind of worth saying as a parenthetical that it's funny, right, that the House was blasted for what it did for the individual market, which is relatively small in the scheme of things. And to the Senate, almost to avoid that reaction, has crafted something that will demolish a much larger chunk of the American healthcare system that involves many more people and really kind of a cross section of America.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only reason this makes political sense is that people in the individual market seem to be a little bit more politically active, seem to be better represented in the media, they seem to have a little bit more voice in politics, and maybe are a little bit higher income, although that's a bit of a question. So I can sort of see the political calculation. The idea is just that Medicaid patients don't vote, right. They don't donate. They don't have, you're talking, in southern states, they tend to be entirely honest, they tend to be disenfranchised minority populations and to a large extent, or disproportionately. I think that's where some of the political calculation comes here. It's safer to attack Medicaid. At least they think it is.